Delighted to be joined today by Kevin Fong. Kevin, in your loft extension, how are you?
Yeah, I'm very well.
Good. Listen, thanks so much for joining me. Let's go back to you were part of the front line during the COVID pandemic and part of the response team to it all. I suppose, and it's a big question, but what did you learn? What was what was the most important lesson during that time for you, in terms of stress, in terms of dealing with kind of the biggest emergency ever?
Yeah, so I'm a doctor specialised in anaesthetics and intensive care. I got seconded into NHS England as part of the national COVID response team right at the start of COVID. It just happened. I was in someone's phone book and quite near the front of the alphabet, and off you went. But it helped me to crystallise a lot of the lessons I'd learned. So I've spent my career, I didn't start out as a doctor. I started out studying astrophysics, finished that, went to med school, worked for NASA. And I spent most of my career looking around other high performance, high risk, high reliability organisations for lessons we could learn. And what COVID allowed me to do was really to crystallise a lot of those lessons. So I've worked for NASA, I've been out to Afghanistan with the military to have a look at their medical response. I work with a helicopter emergency medical service. And all of those small lessons that I learned from that, about how to perform under pressure, really came true at scale during COVID. I think there are so many lessons to go over, but the one that I learned most of all really was the old maxim of no plan surviving the first 5 minutes of contact with battle really was writ large over COVID. And the importance of that for us as leaders and as followers is that you have to be able to delegate authority to your frontline teams. You have to be able to cut the apron strings and let them go. And if you believe in any part of your HR process, your frontline teams are capable of much more than you usually let them do. So that for me was the principal lesson: delegation of authority, deference to expertise. Let them
And,
do it all.
Sorry, and so can I ask, from a leader's perspective then, that delegation of authority, are we more, and maybe do you feel we're more equipped to giving up that concept of, as a leader, we have to lead from the front and we have to be shown we do stuff, because of the experience you've had? Or is it still our natural instincts to be like, we've got to show that we can?
So it's one of the great forgotten things of the 20th century lessons that we should have learned. I spent a lot of time with the Apollo 11 teams, the people who put the Apollo 11 teams on the surface of the moon. We made a podcast about it called 13 Minutes to the Moon. I interviewed all of the flight controllers, all of the astronauts who were still alive from that. We talk about leadership, but we don't talk about followership very much, and we don't talk about that deference. So when you're in a high pressure, fast moving situation, there's not enough time to do what we'd call command and control. I say, you do. You have to be, it's a different style of leadership. It's facilitatory leadership. It's like, I'm going to set the vision, you understand what the principles are, but I trust you to be expert in what you do what you do. And that's how I multiply,
Kevin,
that's how I force multiply what I do. That's how I make sure that what I do is, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's something that NASA learned quite early. The average age of their flight controllers was 26 years old. But I have interviewed a lot of those guys, and every single one of them, aged 20-something, made a mission-critical, life-critical decision in the moment and saved missions and lives. And somehow we forgot that over the 20th century, and we've gone to command and control.
And it's interesting you say it was you think that's what we learned in the 20th century. Do you think it's, and I appreciate you're not necessarily a historian, but is it actually what true leadership has always been, but we just ego takes over?
So I think so. I think we're told great narratives about single individuals. We have the heroic narrative, we have the individual. Now, those great leaders are great leaders, but not in the way we think. Single vision, I get my frontline to execute like they're executing lines of computer code. That's not what great leadership is. Not now, not in complex systems of the type that all of us in big industry, high performance teams work in. And, I've found it myself, with the helicopter emergency medical service. I'm out on a scene. It's not me. I'm not leading that scene. You get out, the phone goes, you go to the aircraft, the pilots are leading that scene because they're in charge of the bit of kit that's going to kill you in the next 15 minutes. Then you get out of the vehicle, the paramedic leads you into the scene to make sure that whatever has killed or injured people on scene isn't going to kill or injure you. And I only have true leadership for a small fraction when I'm delivering the care, and then we go backwards, back to the paramedic, back to the pilots. And it's that sort of team approach, that sort of delegation of authority, deference to expertise that allows you to be a high performance team. You can't be it without that. If you don't use all the moving parts, you're not getting the best out of your system.
And can I ask, kind of, as you said, kind of, you work for NASA, and I was going to ask that, and you've talked about it, and it's amazing. And then obviously you work for the NHS, kind of, and you are working for the NHS, and now you've got a successful podcast. From your perspective, does it frustrate you that we aren't using cross-fertilisation from different kind of industries and kind of successes in order to achieve what we need to achieve? I mean, especially when you're looking at something like the NHS, which needs to kind of revolutionise itself.
Yeah, so we do need to look for lessons from other organisations, but when I was a junior doctor and I sort of spent some of my time working with the Human Adaptation and Countermeasures group at Johnson Space Centre, and then I'd come home and then I'd get some sharp-suited somebody telling me how NASA did what they did, and I thought, well, I know what they do and it isn't that. And what I realised was that you have to embed with these teams to understand what they do. You have to feel the fear that they fear somehow, and you have to understand fundamentally what their model is before you can translate the lessons across. And so, that's why I started working for the air ambulance, because we talked a lot about aviation, we talked about high-risk teams, but until you've put yourself in that position, you can't understand what it is you should be learning. And so it's not that it frustrates me that we don't move lessons across, it's that we don't do the due diligence sometimes. And so, that's why I've loved my career, really. I've sort of done this safari of high-performance, high-risk systems and taken it all back and cooked it, boiled it all down, and, this is where I've arrived.
So, and off the back of that, kind of what interests me is like you step into these teams which are delivering high performance or trying to aspire to deliver high performance. In terms of your credibility to them, how do you establish that to them, and how do you kind of give them that assurance that you're part of the team and you're not coming in to kind of rule the roost over them as such?
Yeah, well, you absolutely don't go into any team that you're embedding with as if you're going to run them and rule the roost. It's quite the opposite, actually. You need to melt into the background and become part of that team. I think it has helped. It's helped me access these teams because there's a kind of set of conversations you have between people who are engaged in these endeavours where you understand each other, and until that sweaty moment when you've been, right on the sharp end of it, life-critical decisions, real consequences, real time, it's hard to understand it. And so there's a little bit of a fraternity, and there's the lovely thing about talking to the Apollo teams when I was making the podcasts was after a while they realised that, I'd done some operational work, and so they talked to me, I think, in a different way, which is what helped us get such great conversations out of those guys. So I think it's about being able to have some empathy professionally for these people, but also really understanding how messy the real moment is and what you can do to keep hold of yourself and your team in those moments.
And again, so I think my last question, which I'm just being nosy, is you've worked for some amazing organisations and kind of NASA, kind of air ambulance, NHS, etc. Is there an organisation or a kind of a industry you'd like to go into and study more and find out more about and learn lessons from?
Oh, there are so many more. One of my ambitions is to spend some time on an aircraft carrier. That's a really interesting, complex system. But as you say, I spent time with aviation, helicopter emergency medical service. I spent time with human spaceflight operations at NASA. I've seen NASA's ESA's astronaut selection process up close and personal. But after all of this, I was trying to bring it back to healthcare to understand how we can improve healthcare. But I'm telling you now, watching my NHS frontline colleagues during the pandemic, it was a joy to watch them become their own masterclass in how you perform against all the odds, to take on something insurmountable, face it down, and to do something that on paper should have been impossible and still prevail. And now it's lovely to be able to go back to other organisations and saying, this was us during the worst emergency that the world has seen outside of war in 100 years. And so that, for me, is now what I'm processing. I'm processing the lessons that all of us can take through from that.
Can I ask on that? Do you think the NHS or certainly the people within the NHS are getting the credit they deserve for what happened? Or do you think it's been overtaken by the politics of the whole thing?
So the politics get in the way, if I'm being honest about it all. If we go off to a difficult job on the helicopter and we go to some pretty bad stuff, at the end of that, you sit down immediately afterwards with a cup of tea, you know, looking into a polystyrene cup, wondering what happened, and you debrief it very honestly, and you're very clear to people about where we did well, and you're very clear to people, and people are clear to you about where we did badly. We still have that processing to do as a country and as a service about COVID, but there is a lot to celebrate, and because we all lost so much, we don't always see what there was to celebrate. And, you know, before COVID, I had just interviewed all of those Apollo control teams who landed on the moon in 1969 with 11, who rescued Apollo 13. I spoke to Jim Lovell's command team and all of his flight controllers. And for me, it was a joy to watch the principles I'd learned in talking to them become real at scale over 1.5 million people in the face of this awful thing. And there is a lot that we should celebrate. There's a lot that any leader or follower can learn from what happened during that time. I mean, I saw a lot, and we should capture that. So it's not really about taking credit. It's about the best thing you can do for your patient or for your organization after something awful has happened is cash in those lessons to give you an advantage of something better in the future. You know, that's what you're doing. You have to have this very healthy attitude to the mistakes you make, to the errors that are made, and a very honest attitude to your success. What was chance, what was design. And I think we're actually very good in the health service, despite what you might read, about processing in that way and about understanding the reality of what we faced and the complexity and taking all of that forwards for more advantage in the future. That's what you're doing. You're cashing in past mistakes for the better chance of survival in the future.
I think, Kevin, on that note, thank you so much indeed for your time. Honestly, it's been fascinating talking and really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great talking to you.